Three superstars won it out of Brooklyn. Three superstars' seasons are now over with their new teams. Weirdly, this feels like the end of the superstar era for the Brooklyn Nets, as Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden's struggles with their new teams may now define their future going forward, with giving the Nets something of a clean slate. We will talk about this and more right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie, the owner and operator of dailyfantasysportsrankings.com. You don't want to type all that in. Just type in dfsr.com, one of the longest running basketball projection outfits in the business. You can grab a free trial to that as well. We've been doing it for years and years and years. Football, basketball, baseball, hockey. It's all covered there over the DFSR. So go check that out. No Adam Armbrecht on the podcast today. We're going to roll solo for this one, but that's no problem. We got tons and tons to talk about when it comes to the NBA in a day that I think, ends up weirdly defining the end of the superstar era in Brooklyn. And you might say to yourself, well, Doug, hey, the superstar era ended when Kevin Durant asked for a trade out of the Brooklyn Nets organization at the trade deadline this year. And I think by, certain narrative metrics, you would be correct in saying that, because that meant all three guys that looked like they were going to define what real top end success meant for the Brooklyn Nets were finally gone for the team. And that's correct. Like, Kevin Durant asks for the trade and that ends. He's the last one out of the office, closing the lights off as he leaves between James Harden, and Kyrie Irving. But what's really become still part of the narrative around the Brooklyn Nets is like sort of what happens to these guys once they leave, once the grass looks greener on the other side for these players, like sort of what happens to them at their next stop. Because, these guys will always be tied to the Brooklyn Nets, and they were there for a short period of time. The expectations were super high. The things flamed out in spectacular fashion. So the names will always be attached. But until we saw like sort of what would happen in their new situations, there was still a part, if you're a fan, and probably frankly, if you're part of the organization too, and really honestly, these guys' success in the future, for some of them does actually define what can happen for the Brooklyn Nets here too. But what happened to them in next stop almost became as important for what happened in Brooklyn, because the time in Brooklyn's a referendum on the career, but what happens next kind of redefines what that referendum is going to be in Brooklyn Nets eyes, right? So when we look at these situations, and I think that came to a close today with James Harden, which we're going to talk about what happened with Harden and the Sixers as they lost to the Boston Celtics, which is ultimately what got me really thinking about this, is like, okay, this actually is the end. It felt like the end when Kevin Durant asked for the trade, but today, Sunday, May 14th, as the Sixers were closed out by the Boston Celtics in one of the wildest second halves you'll ever see in sort of weird ways, this actually ends up becoming the full point stop to the end of that era, because now all three players, James Harden, Kevin Durant, and Kyrie Irving, are now defined narratively by what's happening in their current situations, and it does not involve the Brooklyn Nets. And I think that's an interesting thing to like sort of take a look at from a team perspective, because now we've moved into and we'll go through each guy individually, because I think each guy is an interesting sort of like microcosm into what happened here over the last couple of years with Brooklyn. And maybe in some ways, as Nets fans, you can start feeling better about the situation now that it's gone and you've seen how it's what's going on at the next stop. Like maybe start feel better about, in terms of who you're rooting for going forward, or, what kind of team you want the Nets to have a shape of, or, what kind of, I don't want to say what kind of player you're rooting for, because I think in each of their cases, I did like watching all three of these guys play for sure. Right. Like maybe some more than others. But in general, I would never want to take back the time it was watching KD, Kyrie, and Harden play, because those guys are among the best in the game. And when they're rolling on all cylinders or playing to their full potential, that is fun to watch. That can be beautiful basketball to watch. So would never want to take any part of that away. But as it comes to define what it meant for the Nets to have these guys on the team and to ultimately move on from them, we do sort of get an end of the sentence now, in terms of what it looks like and what it looks like for these guys to move into their situations and say, hey, now it's another team's problem, or now it's, we as the Brooklyn Nets and as fans are in part of the full reset mode now, and the superstar piece of it is just over. And we'll start with James Harden, because I think that's where, and we'll get to KD next, and obviously Kyrie, and that one's, we've had a little more time to kind of digest. But what happened with Harden today in Game 7 with the Celtics, you really kind of had to see it to believe it. And if you were, depending on where you were, landed on Harden, he was the first one out of the door when it came to breaking up these three. He, maybe he wasn't the guy who wanted to be there the most when it came to Brooklyn coming over in the trade. And, maybe it had been his plan all along to sort of facilitate a trade out of Houston and then make other things happen. But if you watch the game against the Sixers today, it was a reminder that, would it have ever worked in Brooklyn long-term with James Harden? It doesn't seem like it could have, right? Like, there's not a lot of evidence that this was ever going to be a long-term sort of solution, even though at the time, look, I wanted them to re-sign him and extend him as much as anybody, because I thought that was going to facilitate moves toward a championship team. But what you saw happen today with Harden was another reminder that if this is the engine that's kind of pushing the team, or if this is the key piece in what you want to do as a basketball team, then there was going to be some like real downside sort of circumstances or downside outcomes that you can expect when you reach certain levels of the playoffs. And that was, like, honestly on crazy full display here in Game 7 in Boston. Like, it was honestly, like, at times watching this game was like flabbergasting. It was, you would never believe that this was a team, watching Philly in the second half, you would never believe that this was a team that had like championship aspirations. You would have thought this was a team, this is not hyperbole, you would have thought this was a team that had never played basketball together before, or in some of them that they had never played a basketball at this level in their life. Like, that's how bad it looked. Want to get into a little more of that Harden game and why it was sort of just a coda on the story, where you don't want him to probably be one of the faces of what you're trying to do as a championship franchise, because I think the end of the series really did end up sort of defining that. We'll get into that in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks right now, they're running this through the NBA Finals. One Prize Picks user is going to get a chance to become a millionaire. One entry placed after 8 a.m. Eastern. Each day will be randomly selected. Whoever gets picked, place that entry, you're going to get a 6-pick flex with the following payouts. 6 correct picks, it's for $1 million. 5 correct picks, $80,000. 4, $16,000. If you want full details on this, you go to prizepicks.com/million. You have to opt in at that link to be eligible for the $1 million entry. And if you're new to Prize Picks, look, it's daily fantasy made super easy. All you're doing on Prize Picks is you're making entries. You're going more or less on the player projections. And it's just that simple. In those projections for the different stats: points, assists, rebounds, blocks, steals. That's if you're rolling through the NBA. Obviously, they have MLB stuff as well. NFL, when it comes around, you pick 2 to 6 players, more or less in the Prize Pick projections. You can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. You're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. Super easy, safe, and fast withdrawals as well. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive instant deposit matches up to $100 with promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. Deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. All right, so this game with Harden today, I mean, look, it was a total disaster. If you're a Sixers fan, which no one, I'm sure, listening to this podcast really is, maybe you are anti-Harden at this point because you don't like the way that he facilitated the trade out of Brooklyn. You don't like the way that he completely and utterly mailed it in. At the end of his time in Brooklyn, I do know there are plenty of Nets fans out there that harbor sort of ill will on a fan side against how Harden moved his way out of this team. And if you're watching how it unfolded here against Boston, it is a reminder to you in terms of the Nets that, one, you're probably happy that he ended up asking for the trade, even though the Simmons part of getting it back is problematic in its own right, which we talked about many times. We don't need to relitigate that here, right on this podcast. But Harden is the first one out. And I think there's a certain, like I said, certain level of Nets fan that wants to look at that situation and probably be rooting against him. Don't find myself typically rooting against the guy category, because I just kind of think it's bad juju, but bad mojo, whatever you want to describe it as. But in terms of Harden, I can see why it is. This game actually ended up hinging or actually turning on a moment where Harden got a flagrant one foul against for basically punching Jaylen Brown in the face as they went up for a contested layup. It was a total and utter onslaught by the Celtics. I don't know if that one moment is what sort of kind of put it all together for them. It really seemed like it. This was the game the Sixers were basically in it midway through, close through the second half, and they completely played the worst basketball you'll ever see, playoff or otherwise, in the second half. Scored 36 total points, outscored 60-36, lost 112-88. Harden himself was a real story, and what a non-story he was in this game. His line for the second half in a Game 7 closeout game for the 76ers, he took 3 total shots. He made one of them a three-pointer. He had 1 rebound. He had 1 assist. He had 2 turnovers, and that was the entire second half of the game. That 41 minutes for Harden, he finished 3 of 11, 9 points, 7 assists, 6 rebounds, was a -30 on the game. That, if you are a person in Nets world who is sort of like happy to have moved on from the superstar era, Harden is the sort of poster child. And this performance specifically is the lighthouse beam that's pointing you into shore around exactly why you didn't want this to happen, because it was such a disaster for him. He was terrible for the final 2 games, both games that could have been won. One of them was at home. They had a chance to close out the Celtics here in Game 6 at home. Harden played 43 minutes, went 4 of 16 in that game, turned the ball over 5 times, had 13 points. Well, it was 1 of 11 over the final 2 games from 3 games that, they win either of them and they move on. So step 1 here, looking at the superstar thing kind of closing out, Harden definitely does it in the most dramatically awful fashion of the 3, for sure. But it was like, sort of like I said, like what ended up putting the period on the end of this sentence. Right before that, though, you did have what happened with the Suns and Kevin Durant over the weekend, where the Suns were finally eliminated by the Denver Nuggets on Thursday evening, where they lost. They got completely blown out, 125-100. You could kind of see this one coming with just the way the 2 teams were matched up. It was really Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and that was it from the Suns. They had nothing else behind those 2 guys. Chris Paul was hurt. DeAndre Ayton didn't end up playing in the final game of the series, or final 2 games of the series. It was going to be nearly impossible for Booker and Durant, who played really both of them pretty awesome. I mean, Durant had a rough final game. He was 8 for 19 from the field, didn't take a 3-pointer. The game was basically over from the jump. These guys had put everything they had into it. The team just didn't have enough. Look, KD wanted out. He wanted to be traded from the Nets. He kind of saw the writing on the wall at the end of this thing. Kyrie had been traded. Obviously, Harden was long gone. Simmons, wasn't looking probably like a guy you could hitch any kind of wagon to. I totally get why Durant asked out of this situation, right? Like, I don't really blame him to most of the degrees. I do think he pretty much left it all on the court for the Nets. This isn't going to be an anti-Durant piece at all. But if you are looking at how this shakes out with a guy who wants to go to a different situation and thinks that there's like title hopes in this new situation, that was, he's dealt a harsh reality when it came to that, where, they got through the first round, struggled probably a little more with the Clippers than you thought they would have. And then they were pretty easily turned around by the Nuggets. I mean, 6 games isn't nothing, but it was 6 games, and that last game was a complete and utter blowout, right? Actually, really, the last 2 games were blowouts. They lost by 16 and then 25. So the series, they went 6. They they put up a puncher's chance. They did, the 2 wins they had, Durant was awesome. It's really nothing against him. I do think that situation kind of comes down to what they didn't have. But this is Nets related as well, because one of the reasons this team had very little behind Booker and Durant, and CP3 got hurt, but look, the dude's old. That guy's gotten hurt in a bunch of different playoffs, so that's not exactly a surprise. Was that the news that had come out that we already knew, that Matt Ishbia, the owner, sort of made the call to make sure that Mikal Bridges was in the trade, that Cam Johnson was in the trade, and all the picks were going to be unprotected to go in that trade to the Nets. And I joked about it, over on the social media stuff, where I was like, dude, make Matt Ishbia a Sun for life, or Nets for life, honorary Net for life, because he might have just really helped sort of save and turn around this situation for the Nets. But it's another cautionary tale when it comes to Durant, of like wanting out of a situation and thinking that this new situation is going to be the cure all for it. And all of a sudden you've kind of unloaded everything that the organization had. And there's really kind of not a ton left to make a lot of moves to improve it. And then at the end of it, you get the situation, excuse me, where basically no sooner had the final buzzer sounded than the Suns fired Monty Williams, and he's out as coach of the Suns. You can kind of see it coming to, 2 postseason epic collapses for the Suns 2 years in a row. They got waxed by Dallas the year before against Luka. So it's like not all that surprising that Monty Williams gets sort of axed at the end of this. But then you say to yourself, okay, well, now as a Brooklyn Nets fan, hey, I've seen this story before. Durant goes to a new situation, and all of a sudden the coach is out. And so when you're looking at this from sort of closing off the Brooklyn era and seeing where the narrative around a player is now shifting to a new team, believe me, right now, the new shift for Durant is around, well, he's on team 3 now, where, coming from the Warriors, where he's on his 4th coach. He's going to be on, his 5th coach since he left Golden State, because they're going to hire someone else in Phoenix. Obviously, Kenny Atkinson was fired, a lot of probably because of the relationship or non-relationship that they had with KD and Kyrie at the time. Ultimately, Steve Nash is brought in. He ends up getting fired, probably more of a performance issue than anything else. And then KD, who seems like he got along with Jacques Vaughn, but asked to be traded. Now you're on to Monty Williams. Now you lose in the playoffs, and now Monty Williams is fired, and you're on coach number 5. That is where the narrative for KD ends up sort of altering again. It's no longer KD. This is no longer a KD. You can look at, let me put it this way. You can look at this situation and as a Nets fan and probably feel a little better about it, that it's like maybe not all Nets organizational stuff here. I think there's a lot of organizational issues. I think that this organization's far from perfect, and maybe they're not even that good when it comes to some of these moves. But you have to now, seeing how this situation sort of ended up unfolding with Durant, you have to look at it and say, hey, look, I mean, this is another team where this has followed him to. It's underperformed expectations. Yeah, look, there's a lot of other context around it. I get it, but they underperformed expectations. The coach is fired. The future is a little bit of a question mark. It's unclear. It's going to get like so much better. He and Booker are definitely the best offensive tandem in basketball for sure. That team is probably going to end up contending again, but did it end the way anyone wanted it to when they traded for Kevin Durant at the trade deadline? Dude, definitely not. Losing 6 games, don't make it to the Western Conference Finals. That's not how anyone saw this story ending. So you look at that piece of it and you're like, okay, well, if it didn't work here and it didn't work at the next place either, is that maybe it's not all in the Nets here. Maybe like this is just sort of what's happening with the dude as they move on to these new situations. And I think that like those 2 doors sort of closing for the Nets specifically, opening for new teams, and then seeing some of the same issues that had sort of plagued what was happening on the Nets, I think you can look at this situation and say to yourself, well, maybe it was just never going to work. Or maybe it came just so close to working and they really almost did it and it wasn't going to do it. And it was just never going to be a long-term thing. And then we're going to get to Kyrie here in a second. But looking at the lens of sort of what happened in 4 days to both Kevin Durant and James Harden, I think you can see what I mean is that like this piece is now, their story is now written completely with the new team. And that's it. And the Nets are like looking at this thing as sort of a blank slate. And we'll get into Kyrie here in a second. All right, just make sure before we get to Kyrie Irving here, I just want to say, appreciate everyone making Locked On. That's your first listen of the day. This week, a couple of more things we're going to talk about. Going to be talking about Jonathan Kuminga, of all people, coming up here tomorrow. Well, interesting news coming out of Golden State with Kuminga. I find him to be a really, really interesting guy when it comes to who the Nets can think about targeting. So we'll talk about Kuminga and what that could mean later on in the week, specifically probably on tomorrow's podcast. Close this off with Kyrie. Look, it's been a while since Kyrie played basketball. Obviously, Dallas didn't make the play-in, so we haven't really talked about Kyrie in a while. I think that's fine. We don't have to spend too much time on it. But it was funny just in talking about these three guys and how these guys encapsulated a certain era in Brooklyn Nets basketball. The Kyrie situation, asking out, wanting to be traded, clearly wanting out of the Brooklyn situation early, ends up going to Dallas. It looks like that pairing with Luka from an offensive standpoint could have and maybe should have worked to the point where, you would have thought, obviously they're definitely going to make the playoffs, right? It's Luka Doncic, it's Kyrie Irving. Yeah, are they going to win the championship? Probably not. But are they going to make the playoffs? You would think, oh, almost definitely. That team had a complete and utter train wreck at the end of the season. And those two guys were on the court. And I actually don't think this was Kyrie's fault. I think Kyrie had an amazing season statistically. He probably should have gotten some all NBA at least votes. He didn't. There's a lot of good guards. But if you just look strictly at his numbers this season, he had a super efficient, awesome season. He was almost a 50-40-90 guy. He was 51%, 39.2% from three, and then 95% from the line. I mean, the dude was hyper efficient. The stuff that happened with the Dallas not making the playoffs is really not Kyrie's fault, I don't think. When he and Luka played together, the offense was completely nuts. Awesome. 121.39 offensive rating. They could not defend a single soul, when they got rid of DFS. That was, and not like that team was great defensively anyway. They allowed a 118 defensive rating when they played together. So it was really, and those guys were just injured a lot, and they were neither was totally healthy all the way through. I don't think this Dallas situation was any means on Kyrie's shoulders at all. I don't think anyone sees it that way either, but clearly that situation didn't turn out the way anyone wanted to, and actually puts it'll be interesting to see what the future holds for him in terms of where teams are going to go with him as an unrestricted free agent. Is he going to end up with the Lakers? That feels like it's probably possible, maybe even probable. I've seen people go the sign and trade route, and he ends up with the Suns. I'm not, where Ayton ends up leaving. We'll see if that ends up coming to fruition. But look, when we look at all three of these guys together, all three wanted trades at different points over the last, year plus. All three went to situations that they thought was going to sort of better their basketball opportunity or better their personal opportunity when it came to winning. And all three teams fell massively, or sort of not even historically, but just they kind of cratered. Kyrie doesn't make the playoffs. That's a total disaster. KD goes down swinging. He played really, really well. The team lost in the second round of the playoffs and lost in 6 games. And by the end of it, didn't really feel like they had much chance to win. Some context around it. And you get Harden, who kind of does very much the kind of thing that James Harden does when these seasons are on the line. He completely no-shows. And honestly, with this one, no-show is a compliment. I know we're going back to the top with where this started with Harden, but calling what happened with Harden today a no-show is being nice about what happened with Harden on the court. It was embarrassing. It was terrible. It was terrible. They were completely checked out for the third quarter. Didn't want to win at all, and just sort of let Boston basically embarrass them out there. As it draws to the end of this, I think you can see that as things move on from Brooklyn now, and you say to yourself, hey, look, why are we talking about these guys? We live in these guys' shadow. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's talking about shadow. I think it's talking about how things came to be with this team, thinking about what could have been with the big three, looking at the situations that they moved on to, and saying to yourself, oh, right, even if I was hanging on to this belief that it should have been so much different had all three of these guys stayed together, these three situations to me crystallized, and believe I was one of these people that thought this, by the way, crystallized to me that it was just never going to work. It was just never, it couldn't have worked full time. This was always going to happen. This was always going to be the eventuality. This was always going to be the way the story ended. This is just how this happens a lot of times in the NBA. And it seems like for these guys, like this might be part of the story that happens for them going forward as well. Narratively speaking, their new narratives are no longer tied to the Brooklyn Nets. It's moved on. The Brooklyn Nets are now moved into a new era where we're going to move on with the guys that we have, and we're going to keep our eye peeled a little bit to the side to see what happens with Phoenix going forward, because, hey, that team cratering in some way would really help the Nets in the future. Dallas, there's some stuff attached to coming back from Dallas as well. We'll see what happens there. Harden, that ship has sailed. We got the Simmons thing going here. We talked about that. That one you just say to yourself, hey, maybe if we had gotten to game 7s and this guy was involved, it wouldn't have gone that far anyway. So as we close this out on Sunday, I'm calling it official end of the superstar narrative era in Brooklyn. That is what happens when these guys all end up getting bounced out of the playoffs with their new teams. So you heard it here first. This is the official end of it, and we can now completely and utterly move on. Maybe you've already moved on. Appreciate it. I needed to get one more little shot in there before it was all over. Like I said, later on this week, we'll talk a little Jonathan Kuminga, talk about other different kind of like players that fit a mold that I think the Nets should probably be looking after. Later in the week, Adam and I, we ran through it today because we did hang out for a little bit. We ran through the situations for all the different teams in the NBA and sort of the upheaval that we might be seeing here coming soon across the league, which might be like historic upheaval. We've already seen it with the coaches. We went through the different teams that maybe aren't totally happy in their situations. It's kind of nuts when you start going team by team. So we'll talk about that later on in the week as well. Make sure you are subscribed over to Locked On Nets over on YouTube. Really appreciate all of the comments there. Weigh in about what you think by the end of this era with KD, Kyrie, and Harden. Tell me, like, what were you thinking when you were watching some of these guys play? I can tell from some of my mentions that people were definitely front running the end of this Harden loss. So, and I have a feeling that could be a theme of some of this going forward. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets YouTube as well. Adam is always the one that comes in with the quotes to end the podcast. We'll make sure we just say at the end of this one, Adam Armbrecht, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.